In World War II, food was rationed to the bone. Shelves emptied, fields burned, and families who couldn't grow their own food went hungry. But the space was limited. Many lived in cramped backyards, alleys, or even bombed-out courtyards. And still, they managed to pull fresh vegetables from the soil. They stacked gardens where no soil existed, stretched harvests from scraps most would throw away, and turned the smallest patches of earth into lifelines that carried them through years of war. These tricks weren't shared widely. They weren't written down. They were learned in silence, passed from neighbor to neighbor, and nearly forgotten when peace returned. Today, those same methods could feed anyone facing scarcity again. Simple, ingenious, proven under the hardest conditions modern life has never tested. Subscribe now and reclaim the forgotten gardening secrets that once stood between hunger and survival. Number 1. Vertical wall gardens. In the war years, land was not generous. Cities were bombed, courtyards were rubble, and most families had no open ground left for planting. Yet hunger did not wait for space. The solution was found on the very walls that surrounded them. Wooden crates, tea boxes, and salvaged planks were nailed to fences and walls. Inside, soil was packed by hand, often mixed with composted scraps and ash to give it strength. Seeds of lettuce, cabbage, and spinach were pressed into the narrow spaces. Within weeks, green shoots clung to the walls like silent defiance against scarcity. This method was more than clever. It turned every flat surface into farmland. A bomb-damaged building could feed families from its shattered bricks. Even narrow alleys became lined with vertical gardens, each crate a pocket of survival hanging above the mud. For families who thought they had no soil left, suddenly every wall became a field. The beauty of vertical planting lay in its efficiency. Greens grew quickly, harvested leaf by leaf, and regrew again. Roots stayed shallow, so even a small wooden box produced meals. And by raising the plants above the ground, families protected them from rats and pests that roamed the ruins. But the system carried limits. Heavy rains sometimes washed soil away. Crates weakened, splitting under weight, and had to be replaced often. And while leafy vegetables thrived, root crops demanded deeper earth. Yet even with these flaws, vertical gardens stretched rations further than expected. A single wall could supply vitamins that stores no longer offered. For children of the war, these gardens carried another meaning. They saw life returning in places where destruction ruled. Green leaves against gray rubble became a sign that survival was possible, not someday, but today, right outside their window. If the world stripped you of land, would you remember to plant on the walls around you? Number 2. Bucket and tin pot farming. When ration lines grew longer and gardens shrank smaller, families looked at what they already had: buckets, fuel cans, and biscuit tins. What once carried oil, paint, or supplies became something far more valuable: farmland in metal. Holes were punched into the bottoms with nails or bayonets, allowing water to drain. Soil was scraped from parks, ditches, or bombed courtyards and packed into the containers. Seeds of potatoes, carrots, onions, or beans were dropped in. Within weeks, life began to grow inside what had once been scrap. The genius of tin pot farming was mobility. These makeshift containers could be carried indoors during frost, lined up along windows, or hidden from looters when food became too precious to display. For city dwellers with no ground at all, every balcony and stairwell turned into a farm. A single row of fuel cans might produce enough potatoes to stretch rations for weeks. Families also discovered that tins warmed faster than open soil. The sun's heat struck metal walls, keeping roots alive even when nights dropped below freezing. And because space was limited, plants were rotated constantly, beans following potatoes, onions following beans, the harvest never stopping, only changing form. Yet limits remained. Metal rusted, sharp edges tore hands. Without care, plants baked in summer or froze in sudden winter winds. But families adapted. Tins were wrapped in cloth, set inside wooden boxes, or stacked in rows for support. Each problem was answered not with comfort, but with persistence. Children often carried water in jars, pouring it carefully into the small fields of tin. Mothers scraped kitchen waste into the soil to keep it fertile. Fathers hauled containers up narrow stairs, balancing them like treasure. In every action was the same truth. Survival demanded invention, and even rubbish could be turned into food. Would you see an empty bucket today as trash or as the first step to feeding your family when stores go dark? Number 3, compost from scraps and ash. By the second year of the war, fertilizer vanished from markets. Chemical supplies were taken by the military, and families faced a grim truth. Even if they found seeds, their soil was too poor to feed them. The answer came not from shops, but from their own waste. Every scrap of life was saved. Potato peels, carrot tops, cabbage leaves, and even crushed eggshells were collected in buckets. Pits were dug behind houses, and scraps were layered with soil. Over weeks, heat rose from the piles as they transformed into dark, rich compost. It smelled of survival more than decay. But there was a twist: wood ash. From every stove and fire, families scooped out the gray powder and spread it across their gardens. Ash returned minerals to the soil, hardened stems against pests, and even kept slugs from eating fragile seedlings. What was once discarded became a farmer's treasure, carried out in tins and scattered like gold. The practice was not easy. Buckets overflowed, rats prowled compost piles, forcing families to cover them with boards. In winter, decomposition slowed, and families turned to smaller indoor heaps, boxes, under stairs or bins tucked into sheds. Children stirred the piles with sticks, learning that waste was no longer garbage, but food for tomorrow's food. The results were undeniable. Soil once pale and thin turned black and alive. Crops that had struggled in barren dirt now pushed through strong and green. Gardens multiplied without a single gram of store-bought fertilizer, built only on the discipline of saving what others would throw away. The lesson carried weight beyond the war. Families discovered that survival was a circle. Nothing wasted, everything reused, every scrap returning to the earth as nourishment. They didn't just eat differently, they learned to see value in what the world called worthless. Would you look at your kitchen scraps as trash, or as tomorrow's harvest waiting to be planted? Number 4, kitchen scraps plus ash combo. By 1941, store shelves held no fertilizer. The chemical industry was feeding the war machine, not the soil. Families stood in their gardens with seeds in hand and barren dirt beneath them. If the ground stayed weak, harvests would fail. The answer had to come from within their own homes. Nothing was wasted. Potato peels, cabbage leaves, onion skins, and even stale bread were gathered daily. Buckets filled with scraps that in peacetime would have gone to pigs or the fire. Now they were layered with soil in pits behind houses, left to rot and transform into black, living compost. Children watched steam rise from the piles on cold mornings, a reminder that the waste of yesterday was already becoming the food of tomorrow. But there was another secret ingredient: ash. Every stove and fireplace produced it, and every handful mattered. Sprinkled into compost, ash balanced acidity and restored potassium. Spread directly around plants, it hardened stems, deterred pests, and kept slugs from devouring tender leaves. Families carried tins of ash out into their gardens like it was treasure, scattering it over soil that otherwise would have stayed lifeless. The combination changed everything. Scraps alone enriched the dirt, but ash gave it strength and protection. Carrots grew straighter. Beans climbed higher. Leafy greens resisted rot that once destroyed entire crops. It was survival alchemy, turning peelings and gray dust into the promise of a steady harvest. The process was not without struggle. Rats raided compost heaps, forcing families to cover them with boards. In winter, decomposition slowed, and smaller bins had to be kept indoors, stirred carefully to keep them alive. Ash, too, had to be used carefully. Too much could burn plants. Too little made no difference. But discipline turned these challenges into habit. Every family learned by trial and error, and those who mastered it ate when others went hungry. This practice revealed a powerful truth. Resilience was built not by buying what you lacked, but by transforming what you already had. Waste became wealth. Ash became armor. And every harvest grown in that soil was proof that nothing needed to be lost, not even the scraps. Would you see today's waste as trash or as tomorrow's harvest waiting quietly in the soil? Number 5. Window box harvests. In cramped cities where gardens no longer existed, windows became the last frontier for food. Apartment blocks, terraced houses, even shattered buildings with missing walls, all sprouted narrow wooden boxes fixed to their ledges. Inside these makeshift containers, families grew what little they could, one leaf at a time. Soil was scavenged from parks, railway embankments, or bomb sites. Boxes were filled, often no deeper than a handspan, yet they held the power to grow spinach, lettuce, parsley, and other fast crops. Seeds sprouted just inches from the glass, where mothers leaned out to water them with cups of saved dishwater. It was survival, pressed against the pain of every home. Window boxes carried more than food. They carried control. Families who once depended entirely on ration coupons suddenly had fresh greens within reach. A pinch of parsley, a handful of lettuce leaves, or a small bunch of radishes became the difference between a thin soup and a meal with substance. Even children could pluck food with their own hands, watching survival grow before their eyes. But the trick lay in clever use. Plants were staggered, never all sown at once. Leafy greens were picked a little at a time, ensuring they regrew. Families placed mirrors or white cloth inside to reflect sunlight deeper into the box, stretching growth in shaded alleys. Small tricks multiplied harvests far beyond what the shallow soil suggested. There were limits. Boxes dried quickly in the sun and froze fast in winter. A single storm could scatter soil onto the street below. Wooden frames split under weight, and replacements were scarce. Yet these hardships didn't end the practice, they hardened it. Families lined boxes with scraps of tin to hold moisture, wrapped them in cloth to insulate against frost, and tied them firmly to walls so the wind could not tear them free. For soldiers returning on leave, the sight of green leaves in window frames was more than food. It was proof that life endured, that even in cities stripped bare, resilience grew quietly at every ledge. Would you look at a window today as just a view or as a field waiting to feed you when nothing else does? Subscribe now, more hidden wartime lessons are still to come. Number 6. Succession planting. In wartime gardens, the greatest enemy was not always scarcity of seeds. It was the hunger gap. Weeks when crops were either too young to eat or already spent. Families couldn't afford to wait. Every empty day was a day of hunger. The answer was succession planting. Instead of sowing every seed at once, families staggered their planting in careful rhythms. A row of lettuce one week, another row the next, and another after that. The result was a rolling harvest, each patch reaching maturity at different times. No sudden flood of food, no sudden drought, just a steady trickle of survival. The method carried precision. Fast crops like spinach, radishes, and mustard greens were rotated constantly. Families kept calendars marked with chalk on kitchen walls, tracking when each row had been sown and when the next needed planting. It wasn't farming for luxury. It was farming for continuity, for the promise that no week would pass without something fresh to eat. Twists emerged from necessity. When space was tight, families pulled plants early and replanted immediately. Baby carrots and half-grown beets went into soups, making room for another round. Even narrow window boxes or tin cans were managed, like tiny farms, cycling seed after seed, harvest after harvest. The soil itself was never allowed to rest. Ash, compost, and scraps were constantly added between plantings. Families learned that the ground could be stretched almost endlessly if fed back with whatever waste they could spare. Some planted beans after root crops, using the beans to restore nitrogen before starting again. It was an unbroken chain, each crop feeding the next in both soil and stomach. There were limits. Weather ruined schedules. Bombing raids sometimes destroyed entire cycles overnight. A family could carefully plan weeks ahead, only to find themselves starting over from bare dirt. But succession planting had one advantage no raid could erase: knowledge. Once learned, it turned even the smallest patch of soil into a continuous food supply, never exhausted until the gardener stopped working. This technique transformed survival from chance to certainty. Instead of gambling on one harvest, families created a living system resilient, steady, and far more reliable than ration cards. In the middle of war, it became proof that foresight was as powerful as strength. Would you plant all at once, risking famine later? Or would you stagger your seeds for food that never truly stopped? Subscribe now. More hidden wartime lessons still wait to be uncovered. Number 7. Seed saving and trading. By the height of World War II, seeds themselves became as valuable as food. Rationing tightened, markets collapsed, and imported supplies vanished. For many families, once the last packet of seeds was planted, the future looked uncertain. The solution was not found in shops, but in their own gardens. Seed saving. Every harvest became 2 harvests, one for the table and one for the next season. Families selected their strongest plants, the cabbage with the fullest head, the bean with the longest pod, the tomato with the richest color, and let them go to seed. When pods dried or heads turned brittle, the seeds were carefully collected, cleaned, and stored. Small paper envelopes, glass jars, or even folded scraps of newspaper became treasure chests, each holding the promise of another year's survival. The practice demanded patience. Seeds had to be dried fully, or they would rot. They had to be kept safe from damp, rodents, and theft. Families often tucked them into hidden corners of cupboards, sealed tins, or jars buried beneath the floorboards. For civilians who had nothing left to trade, a packet of saved seeds became a currency of its own. And trade they did. Neighbors swapped beans for peas, cabbages for onions, radishes for spinach. Communities built small networks of exchange where variety meant resilience. One family might fail to grow carrots but succeed with beans. Another might struggle with cabbage but excel with turnips. Together, their saved seeds ensured no one relied on a single crop. There was also ingenuity. Some families labeled jars with chalk so they could be reused endlessly. Others coated seeds lightly with ash to keep insects away. In bombed-out neighborhoods, children carried packets under their shirts, protecting the future harvest as though smuggling gold. To lose the seeds was to lose tomorrow's food before it had even sprouted. The limits were harsh. A bad season could destroy seed stocks. A single wet week might mold everything stored in paper. And not every saved seed reproduced true. Hybrids sometimes failed. But compared to the alternative, empty gardens, barren soil, the risk was worth it. Seed saving was not a choice. It was the foundation of continuity. Through this practice, survival extended beyond individual families. Seed trading turned strangers into allies, neighbors into partners in endurance. It was a silent pact. Share what you can, protect what you must, and trust that tomorrow's harvest is built in today's discipline. Would you remember to save the best of your garden, not for your plate, but for the future? Subscribe now, because the forgotten lessons of resilience are not just history, they are preparation. World War II was more than battles fought with weapons. It was a daily struggle fought in kitchens, courtyards, and window boxes. Families who had no land grew food on walls. Those who had no fertilizer turned scraps and ash into life. Seeds were saved like gold, traded like currency, and guarded as fiercely as any ration card. The lesson is simple but unshakable. Survival was never about abundance. It was about ingenuity. When the system collapsed, resilience grew out of resourcefulness. What most people today throw away, scraps, ashes, tin cans, became the lifelines of entire households. These gardening tricks weren't hobbies. They were shields against starvation. They fed children in bombed-out streets, kept soldiers alive on leave, and gave civilians hope in the darkest winters. Each method is proof that when everything else fails, human creativity endures. And that's why these forgotten lessons matter now more than ever. Because comfort is fragile. Supply chains are fragile. The idea that supermarkets will always be full is fragile, but skills survive. What these families carved out of nothing can still prepare us for tomorrow. If you've watched this far, it means you understand the value of knowledge that doesn't expire. Knowledge that kept people alive when everything else was taken from them. So subscribe now, not for entertainment, but to reclaim the resilience that history tried to bury. Because the next test won't wait for you to be ready. And when it comes, it won't be the strongest who endure. It will be those who remember.